All right. Hello, worship arts. Here we all are again. Apologies if there's some background noise. I have my dishwasher running and my laundry going, so there's a little bit of sloshy water sounds in the background. So if you want to just pretend it's like a ASMR touch to this video for us, then have at that. And if it's just annoying to you, then I apologize. But I want to take a moment to talk through chapter 8 and 9 of John and just in general kind of talk through our next few weeks moving forward for this class. We've been working through John. You've all been doing a fantastic job with reflections. You've been doing a great job as far as breaking down some elements of Holy Week. It was really neat getting to see some of your plans for that. And so we have essentially 4 more weeks. And so this is our 4th to last week of our calendar for school, I think. Wait, hold on. I'm just going to double check that real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, this is the 4th to last week of our school year this year. So what we're going to try to do then for these last 4 weeks is work through as much of John as we can. By the end of this week, we'll be through chapter 9. And there are 21 chapters in John. And so can we make it through 12, 13 more chapters in 3 weeks? I think we can. It's tough, though, because John is like jam-packed with stuff. So I'm going to try to have self-control and not want to try to over-unpack too many things at once and maybe up our amount of chapters we cover in a week starting next week. But with that, chapters 8 and 9 for this week. Just like the video I put out for you guys 2 weeks ago, I would love if before you went on with this video, you pause to be able to read both chapters 8 and 9, as well as opened up the notes that I've attached into the digital resources section of this lesson on Plus Portals, so that you have my typed kind of notes for all of you. I have a lot of things typed for chapter 8 because there's a lot of things going on in this chapter. And so I'd love for you to have those notes handy to be able to look through. Of course, I'm going to encourage that you write those notes into your class notes so you have kind of a running record of what we've covered and what we've talked about, which should then especially be helpful as you review each chapter in discussion posts on Turnitin.com. So before we start, again, pause, read chapters 8 and 9, get the notes handy, and then I would love to start talking about each chapter with all of you. So before I start with chapter 8, I just want to say I'm really proud of all the work you guys have been doing. I'm really encouraged by how many of you are still kind of plugging into the study that we're trying to do, whether it's just reading John or whether it's doing the reflections. It's really been encouraging. It's been moving to me to kind of see all of you still plug in and still work in the growth and the learning that's being put in front of you. In the time we're in right now, it can feel like there's not really much light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't really know when it'll be here or how it'll be here, but I promise you that someday there'll be light at the end of the tunnel and we'll make it through all of this and we'll be on the other side. And when we get there, we'll be able to look back and see ways in which we've grown, ways which we've kind of changed for the better, opportunities we had to kind of cut some things out of our lives that weren't helpful for us or were pulling us away from in some ways. And I'm really not trying to silver line this or say like, we're going to be happy this all happened, because I really don't think we are going to be. But I promise you that you're not alone. I promise you that God's still working and God's still shaping you and growing you. God is still tending to you through all of this. And I'm proud of the leaders that you are. I'm proud of the thinkers that you all are. So with that, I'm just going to kind of hop through a couple of my thoughts for John chapter 8 and 9 to hopefully help with some of the notes I have down for you, to help them kind of either make more sense or just point out the things that to me stand most out from these two chapters. So starting with John chapter 8, Right off the bat, we have this story of a woman who is brought to Jesus by these Jewish officials. And they say, Jesus, this woman was committing adultery. We look in the Old Testament and it says, stone her. So what do you say we should do? And we're used to, of course, by this point, the Jewish officials, the Pharisees and the scribes are coming to Jesus trying to trap him in a couple different stories. And in this story, there's really like a double trap. This is one where they're, in their minds, the Jewish officials, the Pharisees, the scribes, they're thinking like, there's no way Jesus makes it safe out of this one. First off, the easy trap that we can see is they're, of course, trying to get Jesus to say something like, oh, the law of Moses, the Old Testament doesn't matter anymore. That's what they're trying to get him to say. But there's another side to this trap. They're trying to get Jesus on the other side. If Jesus says, no, actually, yeah, but let's uphold the law, we should stone her. Rome did not allow any type of execution that wasn't like a Roman sanctioned thing. So to stone someone for religious reasons, this would get you arrested and put to death by Rome. Rome is all about order. Rome is all about having control and authority and power. And so allowing other religious groups to do some type of like a public execution like this, Rome would never allow that. So for the Jewish, the Pharisees, they're thinking like, we've got Jesus on this one. Either he's going to say stone her because that's what Moses says to do. And so in that sense, then we can give him to Rome and say he wanted to do a public execution, so you need to kill him. Or they're hoping Jesus will say something like, well, we don't need to follow those laws anymore, which allows them to say, we thought, well, turns out you're not the Messiah then if you say the law doesn't matter. Jesus hits them with this amazing non-answer that also is so, helpful, I guess, in ways that also are kind of difficult to grapple with. Jesus says that classic line of, let whoever is here that has no sin be the first person to then throw a stone. He basically just says to them, if any of you are sinless, then you can go ahead and carry out the judgment here. And they all look at each other like, well, shoot. And we get a funny moment. Jesus draws something in the sand. It never tells us what he's drawing or writing. I had a college professor that always would point this out as like the funniest thing Jesus ever did, which was just draw something in the sand and then us never being able to know what it was and us just being like, Jesus, what did you draw? What did you write? But of course, that's not necessarily the point of the story. The point of the story here is what Jesus does in his response is fill everyone there with grace and compassion in his response. Now, of course, we're used to Jesus sometimes like correcting the Pharisees, but remember, every time that Jesus corrects the Pharisees, he's giving them an opportunity to actually learn their lesson and change their ways. When Jesus corrects them, he's not trying to turn them away. He's actually trying to turn their hearts towards God, how God actually is. So when he says, let whoever's without sin be the first person to throw the stone, he's really telling them, like, you don't understand. One, judgment belongs to God alone. And two, God is here for sinners like all of you. The Pharisees don't quite get this. They go away kind of disappointed and grumbling and mumbling. But Jesus also, of course, is showing this response that has so much grace and compassion for the woman too. So someone who has indeed been living in a way that's clearly not what God intends. She's, of course, sinned. But what Jesus is saying to her is, you've sinned, and everyone has sinned, and the particular way you've sinned is no worse than the particular way anyone else sins. You are in no way too far from how far God can go. You are right where God wants to meet you, which is someone who's been caught in sin that is looking for a different way to be. And so Jesus is filling everybody with grace and compassion. It's just a matter of who is actually looking for it and listening for it in this story. Now, in the next few portions of chapter 8, we get a couple big I am statements from Jesus. The first, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. The second one, Jesus says this line in which he says, before Abraham even was, I am, or the I will be who I will be, right? And one that gives us some good God claims from Jesus. But a couple things I just want to point out here. The type of light that Jesus says he is is a light that actually does away with darkness. Jesus' light doesn't just make the dark less dark. The way Jesus describes it is that darkness can't be around Jesus. And so turning towards Jesus means turning away from darkness or the things that would make us more blind to God. More on the idea of being blind to God for chapter 9. But I want to keep moving. The other aspect then is before Abraham was, I am. Jesus is once more reiterating that it is by Jesus that everything is created and that Jesus has been there from the beginning of time. And if these people around Jesus were to follow Abraham or to follow the words of Abraham, then they should be open to who and what Jesus is. Chapter 9, then a couple just brief things to point out so this video is not too long. Here we get the sixth sign of Jesus's divinity and his lordship. That's included in the book of John. It's another Sabbath day healing. This time he's healing a man who's been born blind. Now, at the beginning of this story, the disciples actually asked Jesus, hey, is this man blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? Now, what that does for us is it teaches us something about the time period. It tells us that people at that time thought that if you had some kind of disability, it was because somewhere in your generations, somebody sinned. That like sickness or pain or a disability was like God's way at getting back at you or your ancestors for sinning. And Jesus doesn't actually like acknowledge it. He doesn't say like, actually, yeah, you're right. Instead, he completely reframes it. He says, no, you guys don't get it. Sin, brokenness, all of that is an opportunity for God to show God's goodness and God's might. So it completely reframes. It's not about any sin that this man or his family has committed. It's all about opportunity for God to show goodness, God to show healing. And then Jesus does it. He heals. Now, what's, again, neat about this story shows up kind of after the healing. The healing happens really quickly in the story. The rest of the story is everyone going through that whole process of what just happened and how did that just happen? So first off, the people that knew this man before, they like refuse to believe that it's actually the same guy now that he can see. Eventually, they're like, okay, we get it. You are actually the same one, and now you can see. But how did that happen? And basically, the man's response is, I don't know, some guy named Jesus healed me. He doesn't have anything that shows that he really understands that Jesus is like the savior of the world, the Son of God, God in man. And he doesn't seem to have any understanding of like the deep theology behind it. Instead, he just says, this man named Jesus is the one that healed me. And later he's questioned by these Jewish officials because they're trying to really unpack like, is this Jesus like just a magician who's, doing tricks that we can try to point out why he's not really actually the Messiah? And so they're trying to get him to explain how were you healed? And basically the man says, I don't know, but what I do know is I once was blind and now I see. And it's this beautiful answer because you can almost in some ways, you can almost see the guy or feel the guy is like laughing. Like he's like, guys, really, I have no idea. I can't explain it. But what I do know is that I was blind and now I see. And I think it's this beautiful imagery of what following Jesus, of what faith in Jesus looks like. We don't always get the ways of God. We can understand some ways about how God is and who God is through Christ. But we don't always know that day in, day out of just how exactly God is working on our hearts today or tomorrow or the next day. But what we do know is what God is trying to do in our lives. God is trying to take us from a place of being broken to a place of being whole. God's taking us from a place of being sick to a place of being healthy, fully restored. This story here is not just telling us a story of healing from physical blindness. We get this statement by Jesus at the end of the chapter in which Jesus says, look, when people meet me, they're either blind and then they see, or they see and then they're blind. And we're left with this, what does that mean? And here would be the best way I could try to kind of explain it to you. When Jesus shows up in your life, or when you're asked to contemplate who Jesus is, you're either in a place in which life like was broken for you, or you like needed healing, or you had areas of sin that you just had hard times turning away from. And through the grace of Christ, you're actually able to make changes. By the power of the Holy Spirit, these fruits of the Spirit start showing up in your life. This is this idea of like, you go from spiritual blindness to like, you can see now. And that doesn't mean like you've arrived, right? It means that like you're in this process of growing and shaping. God's guiding you, God's teaching you. Or you go from being able to see to being blind. And this is kind of the scarier part in some ways. I would describe this as being able to see first before Jesus is in your life means like the world makes sense to you and you're good at living in it. I would really say this is like you're pretty good at living in routine. Like the idea of who Jesus is more convenient and not anything that's really meaningful for you. You're good at knowing what Jesus says, but it's just too hard to kind of do the things that Jesus does. And when you're presented with Jesus, the real actual Jesus, the one that calls you to love the people it's difficult to love, you're more prone to turn away from that. And that's kind of spiritual blindness. The good news is that you're never having to be stuck there. Jesus always is trying to teach the Pharisees, right? Jesus is always trying to say, no, look, this is how God really is. And so you're really never too far for Jesus to come track you down. And that's what's beautiful about who Jesus is. So that's our chapter 8 and chapter 9. I went probably about 7 minutes longer in this video, so I do apologize for that part, but there's some beautiful stuff happening here in these chapters. I'm really excited and eager to kind of see how these chapters speak to you and how you feel like you can grow from these chapters as leaders of worship. So head on over to the discussion tab on turnitin.com and start sharing your thoughts on that. God's blessings to you all this week as we go through these chapters and as we kind of go through our last month of school together for this year. God bless you guys.